So I finished Endwalker a couple of weeks ago at this point, and I've been meaning to make a video talking about it, but I haven't yet because I can't quite find the words. I did start to do a traditional thoughts on style video where I was just kind of going through, Realm Reborn, Heavensward, talking about each expansion in turn, but I kind of fizzled out on that because I got lost in the details. And what I would want to talk about isn't necessarily like a critical review of the game, or like a kind of like here's each detail and here's what I thought about each detail, as much as I just want to talk about it in a wider scope. So I feel like it's more appropriate to make this video what Final Fantasy XIV means to me. And I know there's a lot of these videos out here, and it's because it was so fucking good and so moving and so important in the message it tells. And to anyone who hasn't played it, I can imagine from the outside looking in, it's a little bit like, okay, sure, whatever. You hear this kind of thing too much and it kind of pushes you away from actually wanting to experience the story. At least if you're like me, I'm a bit stubborn about that kind of thing. You hear that it's like this god tier story and you're like, alright, no story's that good. You have fun over there, guys. But honestly, it's up there with some of the most important storytelling I've ever experienced in any media ever. And every time I say that, because I've said that a couple of times now, it sounds like an exaggeration, it sounds like hyperbole, but it's not. It sounds like the honeymoon phase of I've just experienced a really good story and it's all I can think about, and we have that with lots of stories. But honestly, a few weeks later, I might still be in that honeymoon phase, but I honestly think I think this is something that's gonna stick with me. When I was around 16 or so, it happened over the course of many years because it was a long anime, but I watched through Naruto Shippuden, and this is the only other real example I have of at least on hand, of a work of fiction that really changed the way I view the world in everyday life. Obviously I still am young in the grand scheme of things, but obviously I was quite young then. I hadn't fully formed my everyone has their ideals, their morals, their code that they live by, and Naruto really helped me shape mine in what I see in the world, what's important. And Final Fantasy XIV is honestly that level of how it's affected me, and I don't really know how to do it justice just talking about it. So let me just, before we go any further, say that I'm assuming if you're listening to this, or if you're watching this, that you've actually played through Endwalker, because I might drop some spoilery stuff. I don't know, I'm going to try and talk about it as freely as I would like to, so I'm absolutely going to be dropping spoilery stuff, I guess I should say. If you haven't played the game, please go and experience it for yourself, because I cannot do it justice, because I'll say that the biggest themes at the end were hope versus despair, and that's something we see a lot of in fiction. And it's like, if I just tell you that, it's like, well, okay, it's one of those hope versus despair, and let me guess, like, hope wins, and you can be all cynical about it, or you can, not even being cynical about it, you can be like, oh, so it does that really effectively, that sounds nice. It doesn't really convey the gravity of the way it's portrayed. The fact is, Final Fantasy XIV takes hundreds of hours to get through if you are just doing the main story quest and nothing else. That's pretty much what I did, and it took me over 200 hours. I think over 300 hours, if I remember correctly. I did dabble in some other stuff, though, but mostly it was main story quest. And my point here is, it's an extremely long story, and unlike some extremely long stories, it uses its own length. It uses its own epic scale and scope to full effect in its finale. And there have been times throughout the game where I have felt like, oh, the pacing's gotten a bit slower here, oh, I'm only kind of learning about this place or these people, and the kind of grander narratives have kind of been put on hold for now, it's not quite as interesting at this particular moment. But honestly, looking back on it, I don't think I would change one quest, because it all coalesces into this beautiful finale of everything coming together, and everything, you look back on everything, and you go into Final Fantasy not knowing anything about the world. You go into Final Fantasy XIV not knowing anything about Eorzea, about its surrounding continents, about its various cultures and populaces, and you go in a stranger. But by the end of a story, the world that you are fighting to save feels like home. It really does. And I'm not even talking about from like a standpoint of because I've made friends there and because I've hung out with like my free company and stuff, and I just happen to have kind of like associated this place as another home because of the people I've met. Because I haven't met anyone in that game so far. I haven't joined a free company. Or I did, I think, for a little bit, but I didn't really get to know anyone, and then I took a break from the game, and when I came back I wasn't in the free company anymore. This is literally all the story's doing at this point. And to have made this journey from stranger to savior, every step of the way it is justified, the story that is being told. And so it's not just like, oh, it does hope versus despair. It's like the hope and the despair are both tangible in equal parts in ways that reflect real life and affect people differently because of their own experiences that they parallel. Something I just want to talk about very quickly is, I'm not going to go through this expansion by expansion, but Shadowbringers, I adored the main story of Shadowbringers, and I honestly wondered what could possibly top it because it was so good. But I would say I loved the Shadowbringers story in the traditional sense of, I enjoyed it because it was a really good story, because it had heartfelt moments, because it was epic, it was grand, it went places I never expected, and that's kind of, I'd say that's how I feel about like Infinity War and Endgame, or that's how I feel about like a bunch of other stories that have been done really well, I guess. Whereas Endwalker transcends that and is more, like I said previously, something that's shaping how I think about the world for years to come. So I mention this because around the start of Endwalker, I was a little bit like, I mean, what's next? The game kind of tells us we've defeated all the Ascians, which is a bit of a lie, but like, we've defeated all like the big main Ascians, right? And so all we're left with is Xenos and that other guy who turns out to be an Ascian. Was that a reveal? Sorry, anyway. So all we're left is Xenos and that Ascian, who's just kind of like portrayed as a rando, because he's obviously not a red masked one, he's a black masked one. And I remember thinking, like, after all the themes of Shadowbringers and all the intricate storytelling about the Ascians and who they were and why they were doing what they were doing, now the final boss of Endwalker is just going to be an Ascian that wants to burn it all down for the sake of it, and Xenos, who kind of similarly just doesn't care about anything, would happily burn it all down, just wants to have a rematch with us because of a transcendent moment. And I was honestly a little bit deflated about that. I was like, well, that's less interesting. But honestly, as you go through Endwalker, as the story proceeds and you learn more about Fandaniel, and you learn more about the Ascians and where they come from and why Fandaniel feels this way, and then you learn about Meteon and everything, it just becomes so much more than even Shadowbringers was. Like, I'm not here to do a video essay about the motivations of Hermes and what that means and the mental health issues he was having and how that translated to the story that was told. I'm not a scholar, I'm not anything like that, I'm no professional, and I don't frankly feel like sitting down and writing a script and kind of making rationalizations of it all. More from a visceral standpoint, that story reached into some of the darkest places that I think a lot of us have. And I guess trigger warning, because I am about to talk about mental health, but you know, for me personally, I'm lucky enough to have never felt suicidal, but I have been to some very dark places throughout my life, and this game, you know, it kind of reached down there and it tickled them. In my teenage life, I had some very troubled times. I suspect I was going through some undiagnosed mental health stuff. Who knows if that's lingering? But let's not get too personal about it. But in my adult life, I guess more recently, I guess a couple of years ago, I have been in unhealthy mindsets of seeing the future as inevitably bleak, inevitably dour, of the feeling that civilization is drawing to a close. Like, these feelings that sound grandiose and over the top and melodramatic when you say them out loud, but deep down, at least for a moment, you truly believed, and which may or may not be the case, but that's not the point here. The fact that you could go through life carrying that kind of burden in your heart is what this game touches on, and the antithesis of that way of thinking is what this game labours so hard and so long to talk about. I'm getting emotional. God. And I'm no stranger of themes of hope versus despair, of light versus dark. It's actually something that in my mental headspace I grapple with a lot. I visualise my emotions in ways which often have scenes like that, thanks to, I guess, upbringing with anime and stuff. So I'm no stranger to the idea of, you've got to, like, find your inner strength and find hope and believe in the world and stuff. But as I've told people in the past, there is a big difference between being able to understand that and being able to believe it. And it's not always a choice as to whether you're doing that or the other. And while plenty of stories help you understand that, and I do in everyday life understand that obviously hope wins out, or hope should win out, or that there's more light in the world than darkness, on a fundamental subconscious level it's often the other way around. But this game made you believe it, and that is something that I am going to take with me. And there is a reason why there are so many videos of people crying playing through this story, and I think it's because that's something that so many of us deal with on a day-to-day basis, and this story didn't just make me believe it, it made them believe it too. I guess it's a difference between a story saying, I know what you're going through and here's what you should do, and a story going, here's why people feel this way, and here's why, you know, this character feels this way too, and here's why maybe you feel this way. And it doesn't immediately outright just have your character go, no, that's wrong, hope should win. It has your character walk in their footsteps and understand their journey, much like the game kind of understands our journey. Does that make sense? I don't know, I feel like I'm getting into rambling territory here. That's kind of what this video is for, right? So I'm going to pull back from the end of Endwalker and its themes and its emotional impact on me a little bit and talk more about Final Fantasy XIV in the grander sense, because this video is called What Final Fantasy XIV Means to Me and not just how I felt about the end of Endwalker. As, no surprise, a long-time World of Warcraft player, I won't say I viewed Final Fantasy with some trepidation, because I do tend to enjoy playing other MMOs, but there's this feeling with playing other MMOs that it's never truly as good as World of Warcraft, or at least as good as World of Warcraft was back in its I hesitate to say prime. I didn't play until Mists of Pandaria, but in its good days. It's tempting to view World of Warcraft as having special sauce, or at least it used to, that other MMOs don't quite reach. And as amazing as Elder Scrolls Online, RuneScape, Star Wars The Old Republic, amazing as other MMOs can be, they do kind of still feel like second place to World of Warcraft in many respects. Not so with Final Fantasy, and I don't want to go on too much about this because you're probably sick to death of hearing people have this take, but seriously, Final Fantasy XIV does it just as well, if not better, than World of Warcraft in many respects. And one of those respects is combat. I think Final Fantasy XIV's level 90 combat is far more interesting than World of Warcraft's level 60 combat. I say that as someone who has recently cancelled their Final Fantasy subscription and gone back to playing World of Warcraft. That's just to do with attention span and differing interests at differing times. I have never felt as in tune with a class in an MMO as I do with my Dragoon in Final Fantasy XIV. I use every button. Like, my abilities are like an extension of myself in that game. It just feels serendipitous, it's amazing, and I think it's something other games need to work on. I also want to mention that I'm not a previous Final Fantasy veteran. Previous Final Fantasy games I have played include the first hour or so of Final Fantasy III on Steam, so I don't know if that's actually Final Fantasy III or like 5 or 6 or whatever the weird localization was. And that's it. I'm really not a Final Fantasy person, so I understand that Final Fantasy XIV has a lot of references to other Final Fantasy games, but what I will say is it's introduced me to the Final Fantasy aesthetic and it's made me intrigued to go and try the other games, of which I have. You may know on this channel I've played some of the other games a little bit already. So this game not only introduced me to the world of Final Fantasy XIV, but introduced me to the world of Final Fantasy too, and I think that's something that's going to develop more going forwards. I think I have a bit of a difficult time appreciating older JRPGs, but I think going forwards I will probably appreciate the modern Final Fantasy games that come out. I think something Final Fantasy XIV excels at is keeping the game part of the MMORPG and taking away the, for an MMORPG that calls their skill system jobs, funnily enough, it doesn't feel like a job to play the game, as opposed to other MMOs, which sometimes do. The fact that the main story quest lasts for hundreds of hours from the beginning of A Realm Reborn to Endwalker is something that I would personally applaud, because in World of Warcraft specifically, not to continue making comparisons, but in World of Warcraft specifically, one of my issues is that some of the most fun content is found in leveling through expansions and learning the story and doing the quests and experiencing the world and all of that stuff, and it feels like it's over all too quickly, and it's so heavily top-loaded with endgame content. And that can have story and stuff and new world to go and check out when patches hit, but for the most part doing the same stuff over and over again. And not that Final Fantasy doesn't have that, but it keeps its previous gameplay expansions, I guess I should say. It keeps the previous gameplay alive, not just out of story necessity, but through gameplay too. Sorry, that sentence was a bit of an ongoing train wreck. Hopefully you understood what I meant though. For instance, my experience playing through Heavensward in 2021 was, I assume, barely different from someone else's experience playing through Heavensward back when it first came out nearly a decade prior. Well, nearly a decade's a bit generous, but yeah, you know what I mean. Like, classes might be a little bit different, but for the most part, we had the same gameplay, whereas in World of Warcraft, they have done time walking campaigns recently, which is a really good addition, which I appreciate, but besides that, it has very much felt like they're funneling you into the latest content as quickly as possible with no care for the previous content. So I will always applaud Final Fantasy XIV for that, for being brave enough to be like, yeah, this is an epic, we want you to play through all of the old stuff because it's very story driven, and there are boosts available in the shop from what I understand, but it would be kind of weird, I think, to do that. In the sake of honesty though, I should add a little criticism, or not a criticism, but a little snippet of truth that kind of runs counter to what I just said, in that I finished the story and then I was going to go and do the new raid series that's just come out, Pandemonium, but I found the grind to get to the item level required to enter Pandemonium to be too long, and I got bored and I left. But to be fair, 2 months is about as long as my attention span lasts in a particular game anyway, and I had already hit that, and when you finish the story, the world feels a little bit emptier for not having any more story for you to do, so I think I'll probably come back to that and really enjoy Endgame at a future point when I feel like playing Final Fantasy again, but for now I just need to let the story simmer in the back of my mind for a few months. I need to recover. Something that I really should have talked about with the story section of this video, I guess, is the characters. What does Final Fantasy XIV mean to me? It means that the Scions are my buds, and I love them. Everyone has their favourites. People had... So funnily enough, I hear that people had a lot of issues with pre-Heavensward Alphino. I don't remember having issues with pre-Heavensward Alphino. I don't know what that says about me. But I thought he was okay. Like, obviously he was a bit stilted and a bit posh and a bit bossy, but I don't know, I didn't dislike him. But then I've also heard criticisms about Urianger, and I kind of like Urianger all the way through too. I don't know. I don't dislike any of them. I guess the one I'm the most ambivalent towards would be Ishtola, but even then, she's like this kind of cool, like, I hesitate to say cynical, none of the Scions are cynical, that's kind of the point, but she's kind of like the wry, wine-drinking aunt of the group, if you know what I mean, which is not what I was expecting when I saw the cat girl, if I'm honest. My faves, then, Alphino, as I previously mentioned, Alice, you gotta love the twins, obviously. Grahatia is my favourite. He's my favourite. I love him. I love that he was the Crystal Exarch. I love that he was super interesting in terms of lore, in terms of the fact that he time travelled and averted an entire disastrous timeline. I love the fact that he we save him over the course of Shadowbringers and we bring him back to our timeline and he fuses with his past self. I love the fact that his Scion version of himself is kind of just a fanboy most of the time. And if I'm being perfectly honest, he's kind of a cute cat boy. The fact that he is undeniably the Warrior of Light's #1 fan and probably has a crush on us probably says a lot about my ego, doesn't it? Thancred's alright, he gets a bit edgy, but then the game remembers Estinian exists, and Thancred gets a bit more cheerful again when Estinian joins the Scions and becomes the edgy brooding one. That being said, I do like Estinian. I constantly say that the game's story really, really hits like transcendent levels when it comes to Shadowlands, when it comes to Shadowbringers and Endwalker, sorry. But I must admit, Heavensward is where I first fell in love with the game. Heavensward is so good, and much like with a lot of what happens in the story of this game, it swept me up before I realised it had done so. Like, there are moments in the game where you're like, oh shit, I care about these characters, when did this happen? Heavensward was like, oh shit, I adore this game, when did this happen? I think Heavensward is when it really surpassed alternate MMO status in my mind. Although, is that fair to say, considering I took a break during Stormblood and only really became extremely invested in Shadowbringers? I don't know, who really cares? It's a good game, it's a good fucking game. So yeah, I guess I should talk about, I don't think I've left out anything I wanted to talk about. I guess I should talk about the future of the game. Because Endwalker, very interestingly, ties a bow on the story. It's done, it says fin. And that in itself is unprecedented for an MMO. Every MMO has like, ooh, what's going to be the next thing? Or in ESO's case, you know, every story is kind of self-contained, but that's its own kettle of fish. But Final Fantasy XIV, it kind of feels like a finished game at this point. And while there are certainly things we could go off and do, it definitely feels like we'll be starting from square one. And my concern for the next expansion, whatever it may be, is that it'll be a bit like Stormblood, in that it's like a step back in terms of the level of story that's being told, or maybe not the level of story that's being told, but like the stakes. And whenever the stakes lower, I inevitably, like the shonen shit I am, go, it's not going to be interesting again for a while, is it? Because no one's throwing planets at us anymore. I didn't talk about the Meteon fight! Okay, quick aside. The Meteon fight itself, like, let's talk about the trials themselves in Endwalker, just very quickly, because it's a quick way of summing up your reactions to the main beats of the story, right? So Zodiac, first of all, as with many other people, I was like, wait, why am I only, like, level 85 or whatever it was in the Zodiac fight? I was like, but you're a Zodiac, there's still so much more story to tell. And I think the genius of that was they really didn't give anything away about the second half of this story, or the last 2/3 of the story, or whatever, until after the Zodiac fight. It kind of came out of nowhere. I remember thinking, like, I'm on the moon, here's Fandaniel, here's Xenos, Zodiac's down there, this is probably the last zone. Why am I only like level 85? Because I think I was a couple levels higher because I went from Shadowlands into Endwalker. But yeah, I did really enjoy the Zodiac fight as well. I went in and I was like, apparently this guy's really hard, and the group was like, yeah, don't worry about it, follow us, you'll be fine. They were really nice and we got it right first try. Anyway, so yeah, that happened. And then second trial, Hydaelyn, I did it with my Scions. I did it with my Scions, if you know what I mean, and then I fought Hydaelyn. No, I thought it was very poetic that we ended up fighting Hydaelyn in a test of might, and you know, the stakes were as high as they could possibly be, but she wasn't really our enemy, but she was really trying to kill us, obviously. And she was like going through the different like classes that the Warrior of Light can be, and then the sadness at the end when she dies. That was my first shedding of tears. Actually, wait, maybe it was Urianger talking to Moonbreeder's parents. Did I? I can't remember if I got teary about that. I got emotional, but I don't remember if I got teary. I definitely got teary when Hydaelyn died. Which is funny, because if you'd have asked me at the start of this expansion, how do I feel about Hydaelyn, I would have been like, she's fine, I guess. But like, this game really has a habit of sneaking up on you and being like, surprise, you care about these characters. And then of course the final trial, Meteon, the end singer. Oh my god. The music in that fight, not to quote Xenos or anything, but it is transcendent. Everything about that fight is transcendent, if I'm being perfectly honest. It's literally transcendent in how it utilizes limit breaks. I don't think I could have asked for a more epic final boss of Final Fantasy XIV than fighting the literal physical manifestation of despair as, I guess, a physical manifestation of hope, while riding on the back of Xenos as Shinryu across the universe. What the fuck? While she throws planets at us, no less. And then, of course, the glory of that entire boss fight is the second phase. The boss theme plays, it's our theme, we're the final boss. Like, how cool is that? So yeah, I'm a little bit concerned to see how they're going to continue the story after that, but continue the story they are, and I will surely be along for the ride, or Tamara Seraphorn will be. I'll be piloting him. And yeah, that's what Final Fantasy XIV means to me. Over the culmination of these 25 minutes, hopefully I've made it clear to you just what this game means to me. Thank you very much for watching. Feel free to leave a comment letting me know what you thought about Endwalker, or the spoilers that I've just given for Endwalker. Please don't have watched this if you haven't played it. I've just ruined so many hours of storytelling for you. That's besides the point. I'm going to end this video now. Okay, bye. Oh, and don't forget, you can watch my series, my series where I play through all of this stuff in live action.